Q&A throughout the presentation as well. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. We might have a few more people popping in here tonight, but I'm going to go ahead and get started with the presentation. Thank you all so much for just joining this first ever virtual experience for Mission Connection. As I was saying earlier, I think this is my third or fourth year at Mission Connection, but clearly I've always been, in the Pacific Northwest. But I'm tonight home near Raleigh, North Carolina. And so my twin 8-year-olds are very happy that mommy's home. So there's some silver linings with COVID, right? So just a little bit about me and how I'm even talking about this, or what brings me to this topic tonight. I grew up as a missionary kid. So my parents have been on the field for 35 years now. So I went when I was 8 years old, grew up on the field, and then went to college in the States, had hoped to always go back overseas myself at some point. But God just opened a lot of doors for me to work in the local church. I've also worked in Christian higher education for many years. And it was really while I was working in Christian higher education and seeing a lot of young people coming into the university setting, wanting to serve the Lord in some way, whether going overseas or, in the local church or in a faith-based nonprofit, and coming to the Christian university setting to really learn and prepare themselves. But as they engaged in internships or as they engaged in their first couple years of ministry, we were seeing many of them become kind of disillusioned, disheartened, frustrated, discouraged. In some cases, walking away from, ministry altogether. In some cases, even walking away from their faith altogether. And so while I was working in the Christian university setting, I really gained a passion for understanding who are these young people that we're serving today, and how do we equip them? How do we engage them in ways that are going to allow this generation of Christian leaders to just thrive in serving the Lord wherever he would call them? So that's kind of my story. For about the past 8 years now, I've had my own business doing training, consulting, coaching on generational trends, how to engage young people in ministry, in the workplace, as volunteers. I work a lot with missions agencies, kind of looking at some of these topics. So that's kind of what I do. I also continue to work at several Christian universities as well, teaching adjunct. So tonight we're going to kind of do what I always like to call the 40,000 foot view and consider the context in which young people are growing up today. I'm going to focus in on American and Western culture a little bit at the beginning, and then kind of expand and talk about some of the global trends that we're seeing with this emerging youth culture. So I'm going to talk kind of high level tonight, more of the values, worldviews, those kinds of things. Tomorrow in my session, I'll get more into the specifics, the nitty gritty of, communication styles, work ethic, those kinds of things. So a little bit closer to the practical piece. So the workshops will kind of tie together. So to start tonight, I would love if everyone would post in the chat box just what you see as one of the greatest cultural changes or shifts in our society that has occurred in the past 5, 10, 15 years. So if you'd be willing, just dump in the chat box a word, a phrase. What do you see as the greatest change or shift in our culture? Let's think specifically American or Western culture for the purposes of this discussion. So just drop that in the chat box. Also, I'll just remind you that there is a link at the top of the chat box. If you would like all my notes from tonight and tomorrow, you can fill out the little Google form that's in that link, and I will send you all of the notes. So just be sure to check that if you would like those. Okay, we have some great comments coming in here. Yes, instant access to information, everyone on their phones, connected, but not necessarily deeply. So a lot of superficial connections. Yes. Truth. Yes. Interest in preference more than truth. That's a great one. We're going to get into that one tonight. Social media. Yes. Tied to the phones, but lacking social skills or soft skills, empathy, emotional intelligence. Absolutely. Isolation. Yes. It is so crazy. We are the most connected generation ever. And yet what we're seeing is the statistics of isolation and loneliness are the highest ever. And that was pre-COVID. So those statistics have increased even more since COVID. People claiming to be spiritual with approach to faith. Yes, picking and choosing between belief systems. So we call it shopping, right? So they're shopping around to decide what they believe or want to believe. Values blurring. Yes, we're going to get into that. The sense of justice. Yes. But change in what justice is. Yes, how we define justice. So I'm not going to have time to get into all of this tonight, but yes, you're hitting on a lot of great things that we're going to touch on tonight. Go ahead and keep posting there in the chat box. And like I said, continue to chat throughout my presentation tonight if you'd like. So I'm going to go ahead and just jump into some of the trends that we're seeing with this generation. So I'm going to throw some slides up here so we can kind of follow along with me. So here's what we're seeing globally is that cultures used to be more static. And I know a number of you have talked about just being in global missions. You're internationally, you're not necessarily always here in the US. And so what we're seeing is, whereas cultures used to be very isolated, very based on geography, really well defined, there is a blurring even globally of cultural lines. So things like globalization, migration, technology are really lending themselves to more diversity and more blending of cultures. And this is impacting young adults globally. So what we're seeing is that cultures are becoming more mutually influential and blended. And for the first time ever, we are seeing the emergence of what some call a global youth culture. So this has never happened before, where young people globally are often relating more to other young people in different cultures and countries than they even relate to older generations in their own countries. I saw a recent survey where I think it was around 50% of parents in like 20 different countries felt like their kids related to kids in other cultures or countries more effectively than they related to them as parents. So this is really a unique kind of situation that we're experiencing right now. Now, I will say that the global youth culture tends to be more pronounced in urban areas, and it's clearly nuanced by local cultures as well. So okay, so those of you who are in missions, you're familiar with, how we relate to culture, how we view culture. But really, if you look at the cultural iceberg, the way culture works is that there's a lot of things that kind of hit us in the face, right? When it comes to culture, things that we notice immediately, the way people dress, the way people talk, their expressions, their language, their food, how they organize things. These are the things that are explicit in culture and that we see immediately. And often what we do is we kind of make judgments or assess in response to those things that are explicit about culture. Now, this is true cross-culturally, but it's also true intergenerationally. So often as we're engaging across generations, we are noticing the explicit things that can be frustrating, whether it's you're on your phone all the time, or the way you dress, or the way you do your hair, or the music you listen to. So some of these things are what we notice. But tonight and tomorrow, I'm going to get into some of those explicit things. But tonight, what I really want to focus on are the implicit, which is the bottom of the iceberg. So these are the norms, values, beliefs, worldviews that we're seeing emerging with this younger generation, which often are dramatically different than the values and worldviews of older generations. And it's due to a significant cultural shift that has been occurring in our culture over the last few years. So I'm going to kind of, like I said, this is going to be more of the 40,000 foot view. So when we think about intergenerational diversity, or what makes generations different from one another, there are really three different things that impact how generations develop their sense of who they are and relate to people. So we have life cycle effects, which are really just the way that all human beings kind of develop. So these kind of are similar across generations, regardless of what generation you're a part of. So often I'll have people say to me, well, aren't kids going to just outgrow some of these trends that we're seeing today? And yes, in some cases, they will outgrow them because a life cycle effect, is something that's just normal for all of us. So for example, when we're younger, we tend to feel more invincible, more idealistic, like we can change the world. As we get older, we tend to be more realistic as life kind of hits us over the head for a few decades. The things, though, that really set generations apart and make them unique from one another are what's called period effects and cohort effects. So, period effects are major events that impact us significantly, but that impact us differently based on where we are in our life cycle. So, take the pandemic, okay? This is one of the most significant period effects that we're going to see with Generation Z, this youngest generation, because it's affecting them in the way that they view education now, in the way that they view health and safety, the way that they view connection to other people as they're walking around for a significant period of time with a mask over their faces and not being able to see facial expressions. It's going to leave a lasting imprint in their very psyche as they're developing. Now, for older generations, it's affecting us in many ways as well, but we might be impacted differently than a generation who's still developing kind of their worldviews, etc. Another example would be like the recession of 2008, 2009. If you were a millennial who had just graduated from college with, $80,000 in debt and a degree, and you couldn't get a well-paying job, you would be impacted differently than, say, you were 60 or 65 planning on retiring and you lost your retirement savings. And so these period effects impact us at a certain point of our life and then leave an imprint for the rest of that generation's, you know, life cycle. Cohort effects are trends and values that are prevalent in the culture as we're developing our worldview and core values that leave a lasting imprint kind of on our how we develop, okay, over a longer period of time. So these would be things like education, technology, globalization, parenting trends would be a huge one right now for Gen Z and for millennials, and then even younger generations. So these are just things that are in the culture that leave a lasting impact. So tonight I'm really going to focus a lot on these cohort effects that are really setting Gen Z apart from older generations. So when I talk about generations, this is kind of how I would break down the generations. Different presenters, researchers are going to use a little bit different terms, but roughly these are the terms. So Gen Z, who we're really going to be focusing on primarily tonight, are those born roughly 1996 to 2010, 2012. So really this is everybody who's in school right now, from, just recent college grads all the way down to elementary school, maybe a little bit older, a little bit younger, somewhere in there. Now, the reason that I have those last three, the bottom three generations highlighted is because these are the generations that really represent the shift in the culture. So it was really in the 60s and 70s, really kind of ushered in a lot of new ideas. It ushered in the cultural shift, the beginning of the cultural shift that we're living through right now. But it wasn't until really the 80s and 90s that that cultural shift had worked its way into popular culture and education, into our parenting styles, all of those things. So really, especially younger millennials and Gen Z really represent an entirely new culture in our society today. They have different worldviews, different values, different perspectives, different ways of relating to people. Now, it doesn't mean that every single, young millennial or Gen Zer is going to completely embrace all the worldviews of the emerging culture, or that there aren't 80-year-olds who embrace the values and views of the world, of the emerging world culture. But what we're seeing is just that entire peer cohort is kind of informed by these new trends. So Peter Drucker has a great quote that I just like to throw up because it just really helps understand what we're living through right now. And, I've been teaching on this stuff for about 15 years, and I just keep saying, oh my goodness, like, I know I've been saying that this is happening, but then to like watch it actually happen is so profound. But Peter Drucker wrote a couple of decades ago, he wrote, every few hundred years in Western history, there occurs a sharp transformation. Society rearranges itself, its worldview, its basic values, its social and political structure, its arts, its key institutions, and we are currently living through such a transformation. I mean, if you just look over 2020 and 2021 so far, you can see the incredible shaking that is occurring in every part of our society. And it's part of this cultural transformation that's been occurring and kind of under the surface for the last couple of decades. Now, it's not just in Western civilization that this occurs. These kinds of shifts really occur across all civilizations and have throughout history, but he's just referencing the one that we're experiencing here in the West. So when you look back at Western civilization, this is kind of where you can see some of these significant cultural shifts, right? So the Renaissance, which propelled us out of the Middle Ages into the modern era. You see things like the Industrial Revolution, the Age of Enlightenment, that really propelled us into the Age of Reason that we've been living in for the last couple hundred years. And now we have this postmodern shift that has occurred that is really creating the cultural context that's informing the worldviews of Gen Z and many young millennials. So here's what's to just kind of quickly give you a snapshot of what's changed. So in pre-modern times, we really viewed God as the basis for everything, or a supernatural power. So almost every civilization globally believed in something supernatural that was greater than humanity, that dictated kind of our basis for knowledge and truth. In the modern era, after the Age of Enlightenment and reason, we start to put our faith in reason, morality, human dignity, as the foundations for our society. So I think, therefore I am, right? So really it became very humanistic. We focused on ourselves and what we could figure out. What we're seeing right now in the postmodern era that's been emerging for the past couple of decades, and that really, really informs the thinking of younger generations, is that everything is suspect. Every meta narrative, whether it's history, whether it's religion, whether it's any ideology that you might have, is suspect. So we live in this time of deconstruction, right? And therefore truth has become very relative, and we live in this pluralistic society, right? So Friedrich Nietzsche, over 100 years ago, maybe summed it up best. He said, "You have your way, I have my way. As for the right way, the only way, it does not exist." So what does this mean for us? Like, what does this actually look like as we're engaging younger generations? Here's some of the ways that the shift has occurred. And, as I go through this, often people are like, I think I'm modern, but then as we read it, we're like, no, actually I'm more postmodern. So, but I just want to highlight in practicality, what does this cultural shift look like? So in the modern era, we really made decisions based on facts, logic, and reason. If we were going to decide to do something, we were going to come up with a logical reason for doing it and a plan. When we think about our apologetic and our faith, we would describe it in a very logical, practical way. The Romans Road, four spiritual laws. We had these very logical ways of describing what we believed, what was true. In the postmodern era, what we see is things are much more subjective. Remember, everything is being called into question. So emotion, story, experience are what dictates what we believe to be true and what we feel is real, right? So perception has become reality. So this is a significant shift. We live really in not just a postmodern world, post-Christian world, post-structuralist world, post-colonial world. We live in this world of post, but it's also a post-truth world. Oxford Dictionary's word of the year in 2016. Post-truth is relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinions than appeals to emotion, right? So we're seeing that play out in our culture in so many ways right now, where emotion, story, experience, personal beliefs have really become paramount. So young people have grown up in this world where this has been their reality, that emotion, story, experience, being true to themselves, making themselves happy. This is what they've been told. That is meaningful. You determine what feels right to you. You do what feels true to you. Be true to yourself. And so this messaging is very, very strong, even for wonderful, godly young people. They're constantly inundated with these messages. Another shift that we've seen is just, the shift of distance and hierarchy to just engagement and participation. So we've seen just kind of the collapse of power distance, where in the past, following the Industrial Revolution, we created a lot of hierarchies. Where here we had managers and levels of authority and people who reported to other people who sat in the corner office. But what we've seen with things like social media and the internet is the complete collapse of power distance as people are able to post their opinions and share their beliefs and engage, from the moment that they're, able to pick up a device and actually type something, they can participate. And so as a result of this, we're seeing changes in how people view authority. I mean, like I said, I'm a college professor. My students can now Google in 5 minutes more relevant, up to date information on the topic that I'm presenting in my graduate level courses than what I learned, 10 years ago in my doctoral program in a textbook that now is obsolete. And so the same authority, the same respect is not given to a professor or a boss or a leader just because they have that title. Young people have a different way of engaging with authority, and we have to engage them in a different way to earn the respect. I'm going to talk more about that tomorrow, but it really is based on relational capital, not title, experience, or education. So if they feel like they can trust you and respect you and that you care about them and you're invested in them, that's where power now comes from, through relational capital, not necessarily through title or position. So we've really gone from a world that looks more like the top world to a world that looks more like a bottom world. So one thing that can be really helpful as we're looking to engage young people, whether it's in a youth group or a discipleship group or an internship or just on a team environment, is if they start to feel like there is not a sense of interconnectedness, there's not a sense of, relational capital, of trust, of authenticity, but we're leading out of our power position in the hierarchy, that is going to be immediate turnoff to them. They want to know that they're a part of a team and a community and a family, not necessarily just a position on a flow chart. Okay, some other big changes that we've seen is just this change from determinacy to indeterminacy, which really is that the world is predictable versus the world is uncertain. And I mean, again, 2020 has, accelerated this and deepened it profoundly. So as a result, what happens is young people don't often believe what we tell them because there's truths that we've told them that truths. I don't mean capital T truths, but I mean, like, we've told them principles that have not really played out for them. So things like, if you get a college degree, you're going to be able to get a good job that's going to support you, and you're going to be able to buy a house by the time you're 30, and you're going to be able to, have a car, and you're going to be able to save for retirement, all these things. And we still have a millennial generation that's drowning in student debt. Many of them still living with mom and dad or on mom and dad's cell phone bill, and this isn't even Gen Z, right? So those promises have been broken. So things that they believe to be true are not playing out. So therefore, they question, they doubt, they feel like the world's very uncertain. And why? Why would I try? Their motivation goes away when they're like, and you see a lot of apathy and disinterest because it's like, why try? I can't control what's going to happen. I might have great plans for my life, but COVID might happen, or a terrorist attack might happen, or an economic collapse might happen. Like, why would I try hard? Why would I prepare? I can't control what's going to happen. So helping them process through some of that and determine what is worth being motivated and inspired for is really powerful. And I think that's one of the things as we think about, missions where we have an opportunity. We've also moved from a world, okay, so I'll just say this, with a world of uncertainty where instead of creating, we're deconstructing a lot. We're asking a lot of questions. Why? The next generation wants to understand why. They're used to asking why, and they assume that there are answers out there. So this question of why is very, very important as we're engaging young people. They have questions and they're going to find answers. If we don't answer the questions, then they're going to find the answers somewhere else, because there are plenty of sources of information out there eager to give them the whys. Here's the other thing about explaining the whys and really engaging the young people around us, whether again, they're students, they're interns, they're, team members. as they understand the whys behind things, it really helps equip them for leadership in an uncertain context. Because if they understand the purpose, even if they have to change methodologies or change approaches because of something like a pandemic, um, they're going to understand why we're doing it versus just following directions and doing what you're told, right? So we really do need to help them with the whys. The other thing that we're finding in this postmodern context is sometimes young people don't know how to reconstruct. So they're taught to deconstruct. They live in a cancel culture where if someone makes an error, someone says something they shouldn't say, or someone takes a picture of someone doing something and portrays it in a certain way, that person can lose all credibility. They can lose relationships. They can lose, their reputation can be impacted. So they're seeing, not only are they being taught to deconstruct, but they're seeing this deconstruction of people's lives and careers and industries all around them. And they need to help knowing, how do I reconstruct? That the cancel culture isn't the last word, that actually there is a God of redemption, right? Who can redeem anything, who can build and create and heal and restore. And so it's really important that we engage the whys and help them as they're questioning and asking why, to also be able to find some of the answers that they might be seeking for. Another shift that we've seen is just this move in faith in institutions to faith in individuals, right? So they're much more likely to believe a friend who posts, a review of something on Instagram or Snapchat, or something that they see on TikTok from someone, that an individual, than they are necessarily to trust an institution making a promise or promoting something. So here's one of the benefits as we're engaging this next generation, is that we are individuals. We don't have to have a big brand. We don't have to have a big platform. We just need to be someone that they trust, who they have a relationship with, who they know. Um, and this can be something that can influence them greatly because they're listening to individuals that they care about and that they respect. Another shift that we've, of course, seen, to kind of sum up this whole time that we're living in, is the shift from power and faith in human reasoning to power and faith in personal experience. Here's what's so powerful. And as we were talking at the beginning, a couple of you, about how you're engaging, young people in experiences, is that the Holy Spirit is in the business of giving us experiences with God, finding God. He can invade our experiences, right? And teach us in our experiences. So there are powerful ways where we see God engaging young people right now. There's a young man who works at a local restaurant, who we've known for years. I mean, he was addicted to meth, comes from a broken family, all these things. And he just had, someone gave him a Bible. We've talked to him for years. Someone gave him a Bible and he just started reading it, and he had an experience with the Lord in his room. Now, this has been happening forever, right? But it's so encouraging because God can meet young people in their experience in a powerful way. So we've moved from confidence and reason to discover truth to accepting self-determined pluralistic views of truth. And this is a really big challenge for young people today. Going back to the Friedrich Nietzsche quote, "You have your way, I have my ways, for the right way, the only way, does not exist." It really sums up the pluralistic context in which young people are living today, where they're being told whatever feels true to you is true. Whatever's true to them is true to them. And all truths are equal and valid. So as they're trying to navigate the development of their identity, their convictions, their beliefs, they're living in this world where they're being told to accept all truths as equal. So today, what we're finding is tolerance is the highest moral value of Gen Z. This is true in the US and much of the West, but also many other parts of the world as well. And tolerance traditionally was defined as the top, understanding plus respect. But what we're finding in today's culture is that it's defined as understanding and respect plus acceptance and affirmation of every point as equal and valid. So it puts young people in a really difficult place, because if they have to accept and affirm every point of view as equal and valid, it becomes really, really difficult to have a personal sense of belief or conviction that might contradict someone else's. Because if I have a belief that says your belief is wrong, then I have become intolerant, which is the most significant cultural faux pas I can commit. And so it puts young people in a really, really difficult place. Barna research reports just that young Christians are really struggling more than ever to represent what they believe in this postmodern, post-Christian world that we're living in. They live in this world, this culture of trigger warnings, and they're really worried about saying anything that might be offensive, that might cause them to be canceled, right? In their friend group or in their culture. I mean, talking to godly young people across this country, I just hear them wrestling with this. Like, I play on the worship team at church. I want to serve the Lord as a pastor. My dad is a pastor. I want to go into missions, but I don't tell my friends at school I believe in God. And I don't post anything on social media about God, because the moment that I do, I will lose all credibility. And so there is this real sense of social persecution that's already happening for many Gen Zers in our culture today. And in many cases, what's happening is that the adults in their life are maybe not even aware of it, or not knowing how to help them navigate this new context that is very, very different than the one that many of us grew up in. Okay, so and as we think about not just the youth in the West or the US, but global youth culture and diversity. Well, actually, let me just pause really quick before I move on. Are there any questions about any of these major culture shifts that we've seen so far? You can drop them in the chat box if you want, if you have a question. Okay. Let's see. How are postmoderns at dealing with all the conspiracy theories and fake news that is out there? um, I think that I don't know that any of us are dealing with it super well, right? I think that what's hard is in a world where we've kind of eradicated what is, an absolute truth. Everyone feels that their truth is the truth. And what's happening in a world with the internet and social media right now is that algorithms feed our confirmation bias. Okay, so confirmation bias is that I'm more willing to believe something to be true if it confirms what I already believe or perceive. And so, as you are, reading social media sites or news feeds, you click on the things that confirm your bias that already exist, whether that's a conspiracy theory or fake news or what we perceive to be true. And you just keep getting that same information, which feeds your understanding that that theory or that news is true. So I think one of the most effective things that we can really challenge ourselves, as well as young people today, to do is to really seek out different points of view and to have a posture of learning, because that can help us discover where is the fake news or where are the conspiracy theories that I might have fallen prey to that I need to have some different information to help me recognize. Okay. Okay, when I say the cancel culture, so what we're seeing is just, if there's a show, let's say, on that is broadcasted and something happens in it that causes an uproar, that seems offensive, that show will be canceled, right? We'll cancel that show. If there's, someone in a friend group who says something or does something, or someone portrays something about them that causes, is not acceptable, they can be canceled from the group, removed from the group, right? And suddenly they're no longer belonging. I mean, we're seeing this even now, like with big tech, right? Canceling people's accounts, like if they're saying something or doing something that they don't agree with. So this is the cancel culture where there's very little room for, making mistakes or portraying things that people find offensive without the risk of being canceled in some way. So that's what I mean about the cancel culture. And so what it does is it creates a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress for young people, because they're worried about saying anything, doing anything, portraying anything that might offend anybody. And so when we think about engaging young people in ministry in some way in a culture that's increasingly post-Christian, it can be really, really difficult for them to want to share the truth of the gospel, right? Because what if I offend someone? I'll be canceled. I'll lose all credibility. I won't have a voice anymore, right? I'll get pushed out of that group, or I'll be discounted by those friends. So that's what I would, that's the cancel culture. And it really is just feeding a lot of uncertainty and worry. Okay, let me just see if I missed any. Okay, glad, sure. Okay. Great. Okay, I think I got the questions for now, so I'll go ahead and keep going, but please feel free to add other questions as you're thinking of them. I see a note here. I will post the link again at the end of the session if you'd like the notes from my session where you can sign up for those. I'm going to just keep going for right now so I don't interrupt my flow, but I'll do that at the end. Okay, so what we're seeing, not only are there changes occurring, of course, in the West and in the US, but they're happening, we're seeing this kind of blurring even of cultural lines across this generation. So some different things are affecting that. There's greater diversity in America, as well as there's more, cross-cultural influence via technology and globalization that's happening globally. So Pew Research reports that 14% of the US population today was born in another country. So this is where we're seeing kind of the blending of cultures, even as other cultural views come into America, or there's migration from other countries, not just into America, but there's a lot of migration globally. Beginning with Gen Z, born in the late 2009s, less than 50% of this generation is non-Hispanic white. So it's going to be the first generation that has less than 50% non-Hispanic white. And what we're finding is many millennials and Gen Z relate better to young people in other countries, like we've talked about, than to older people in their own cultures. Now, this is true for immigrants to America. It's true for other cultures globally. I've done these presentations in probably 5 different countries, and I often hear from teachers, parents, yes, we're seeing this in our culture as well. So some of the indicators of the global youth culture that we're seeing are things like secular humanism, the relativism, the consumerism, and clearly the technologies would be some of the main things that we're seeing kind of across all of these different cultures. So Steiger International, who does a lot of work internationally, and again, primarily in urban settings, says that the current urban generation connected by consumerism, social media, and the entertainment industry forms the largest global culture to ever exist. It spans the globe, sharing the same values, listening to the same music, and watching the same movies, sharing the same post. The global youth culture is largely influenced by one predominant worldview, secular humanism, which really states that God is irrelevant and that man is at the center. This is a generation that it does not look to the church for answers. So we're having to find different ways maybe to influence them versus previous generations that might have looked to the church as having some of the answers to life's big questions. In a global citizenship survey, research on the attitudes of 15 to 21-year-olds on a variety of ethical, personal, community, and political issues from 20 different countries, which were very diverse countries, if you look at the list, actually found many similarities between countries. Now, remember, there's still going to be local cultural nuance to how young people engage some of these things. And we're going to see it more predominantly in urban areas, but there is truly this emergence of a global youth culture. This is the first generation of digital natives who have grown up living the human experiment. I love this term because it truly is an experiment that younger millennials and Gen Zers have grown up with access to technology. So the iPhone came out in 2007 and the iPad in 2010. So when you think about Gen Z being born in 1996, by the time they were 10 years old, the oldest ones were 10 years old, there was a smartphone. And so this is a generation that's always known interactive technology. And we gave it to them before we knew the impact it would have, right? So it really was an experiment. And it's changed attitudes towards information, relationships, and privacy, as well as many other things like communication, how we view our identity, many of those things. Here's, a really sad kind of indicator to me, and this survey was before the pandemic, but it says that young people overall globally are pessimistic about the future. In 16 out of 20 countries, young people believe the world is becoming the worst place to live rather than better. And this is really significant because one of those life cycle effects that tends to be consistent from generation to generation is usually a sense of idealism and optimism from the younger people. So the fact that with Gen Z, we're seeing pessimism even before a pandemic occurred is a little bit disheartening and speaks to the increasing rates of anxiety, depression, and suicide that we're seeing with this generation. Religious faith is an important part of less than half of young people's lives globally. So 2/5 claim religion is of no significance to them at all. 84% of young people globally say that technological advancements make them hopeful for the future. So very, very interesting, not looking to religion. A significant chunk of them are not looking to religion for hope, but they do, a majority feel like technology could help them. Okay, so when we look at all these statistics, it can be a little daunting. And it's like, okay, Lord, what does this mean? How do we engage them? Here's what's exciting to me, and here's what I believe the Lord is doing in the midst of all this. I mean, he's doing many things, but as we look at this next generation, I really believe he is raising up what I like to call a Daniel generation. What happens with a Daniel generation, if you look at the life of Daniel, is that Daniel grew up he was a young man growing up in a time of significant transition and crisis. In his lifetime, the kingdom of Judah fell. Okay, the place that God had promised his people, where David had sat on the throne and Solomon had built the temple, God had led them into the promised land. This place of significance fell to King Nebuchadnezzar. He destroyed the temple, he destroyed Jerusalem, and he carried, he killed many of the people and carried many into exile. And Daniel was one of the exiles. And suddenly he found himself not in Judah or Jerusalem anymore, in a familiar culture where there was a tradition of faith that went back years and years and years, a legacy of faith and how it was practiced. But he suddenly found himself in Nebuchadnezzar's palace, the most dazzling building in the whole world at that time, where there were 50 temples to false gods around him. There was food on the table that he was, Jewish law would not permit. There's all these things he was having to navigate that his leaders had never had to navigate. And he had to figure out, what does it mean and look like to be a godly person in this new context? And that's really what millennials and Gen Z are having to navigate. What does it look like to lead in a context where I can't ask mom or dad or my teacher or my pastor or my mentor how they led in this context? All of us are learning together, right? It's a completely different context. This is a generation that when culture is shifting, they have to find their identity in God. And what's so encouraging about this is that, in David Kinnaman's recent book, Mark Matlock and David Kinnaman's recent book, Faith for Exiles, they find that there is, out of all Christian young adults, there's this 10% of young adults that they call resilient disciples. These are young people who are making countercultural decisions and saying, I will serve God no matter what the cost. I'm going to be active in my faith. So these are the young people who choose to live countercultural lives of surrender, service, and selflessness, but they are a remnant right now. The Barna says that less than 4%, or around 4% of Gen Z has a biblical worldview. So it's a very small percentage of the population. And of those who have a biblical worldview, there's an even smaller percentage that would be the resilient disciples who are actively living out their faith. They are demonstrating godly leadership, and they're seeking to honor God in an ungodly culture, even when it costs them. So I think one of the questions, for us as we look at equipping the next generation to serve God, is to identify who are the Daniels, the Esthers, the Nehemiahs, Ezras, Hananiahs, Mishaels, who are around us. The young people who serve God even in an ungodly context, who are hungry for help. They're hungry to know how to grow. They're hungry to know how to serve. They're longing for, support, prayer, direction. I think one of the things in ministry, 2 days ago, Thursday, I was working with a campus outreach group, and we had this great discussion about what are the metrics we should use to measure success, because often ministries are using metrics like the number of young people going, the number of young people coming to meetings, the number of young people committing to faith. But in reality today, what we're seeing is there's a remnant, and we need to focus on this remnant. They are experiencing a lot of turmoil, a lot of stress, a lot of pressure, and they need a lot of support. So as we're seeking to reach the many young people in the world today, I really encourage you to think, who are my remnant? Who are my Daniels and Esthers? Who can I be, a Mordecai to? Who can I be, a King Josiah or a Jeremiah who's faithful to speak truth and create a context where a young person can learn truth, so they're prepared when they find themselves in Babylon? I think just really seeking God's guidance for innovative and adaptable ways to encourage and equip them, because they have unique challenges. So if we're finding the model of ministry that we're using is not connecting with them, be willing to change, because the challenges, the environment that they're facing is very, very different than we've seen in the past. The other thing they need is adults, mentors, leaders, colleagues, people to come alongside them and navigate the new context with them. What does it look like to do evangelism in a postmodern pluralistic society? What does it look like to live faithfully on social media, where they're engaging with friends? Here's a really exciting little quote. Um, Intergenerational relationships are crucial. Drew Deck says, he's written a lot of books on generational trends. He says that the number one predictive factor as to whether or not a young Christian will remain in his or her faith is if they have a meaningful relationship with an older Christian. I mean, this is just so profound to me. If there's one thing that we can do to encourage this next generation, it's to have a meaningful relationship with them. So some of the strategies that we're finding that can be effective as we're engaging Gen Z is to cultivate a relationship, not tell them what to do, not tell them what we think they should do. Our two most powerful tools as we're engaging them is to ask open-ended questions. To ask questions that they have to think and explore and understand. Like one of you said in the chat box, many of them have very superficial relationships. They're easily distracted by social media. They're taking in more information than any other generation has ever taken in. And they need relationships that are going to cause them to pause and to think deeply. And they need a place where it's safe to ask the questions that sometimes don't feel safe to ask in church or in our families, where we don't want to hear the deep questions that they're asking. So ask open-ended questions and be a safe place where we listen actively to understand what is happening in their lives. To the final point here on my slide, I think God's calling us as leaders, as mentors, to really discern what he is doing in the lives of the Daniels and the Esthers around us, and to come alongside what he's doing. Sometimes we come into young people's lives with our agenda for what we want them to learn. And I really feel like in this season, sometimes we don't even know what they need to learn. I mean, God challenges me in this with my own kids. Like, you have your agenda, Jolene, but I know where I'm going to take them and what they're going to have to face and what they're going to have to deal with in their lifetime. I need to trust God, and I need to discern what he's doing in my kids' lives and come alongside and support that. I think, like I said, our relational capital, our authority comes out of our relationship with them. When we're authentic, transparent, when we're teaching like a mentor, when we're answering the whys that they're asking, when we're modeling and communicating belief and hope. Young people desperately, desperately need leaders who are communicating belief and hope. I believe in you, and there's hope for the future. There's hope for your life. There's hope because the kingdom of God is here. The other thing is that they have been raised in a culture of safety that's told them, be safe, don't say or do anything that you might fail at, or that might cancel your credibility, your rapport, your reputation. But we need to teach them to be obedient. We need to encourage them to be obedient versus being safe all the time. That God shows up in places of courage and of obedience, like he did in Daniel's life and Esther's life. They need us to model the behaviors that they need. So often what's happened in today's culture is that everyone's so distracted, everyone's so busy. Young people haven't actually spent time watching older adults. They haven't helped mom with the grocery shopping or washing the dishes or dad fixing the car, because they've been at sporting events or they've been on their iPad or their iPhone. So they need adults who are modeling for them what it looks like to live out faith, relationships with God, what our relationship with God looks like. I remember at the beginning of the pandemic when the grocery stores, the shelves were empty, and we were in the store. This was before everybody was like staying at home. It was in the initial like craziness. We were in the grocery store with our daughters, and we were standing in the bread aisle, the shelves are empty. And someone was just sitting there going off at my husband about, people are crazy. Why are people so afraid? This is crazy. And the lady walked away, and my daughters turned to my husband and they're like, Daddy, why are we supposed to be afraid? And so there's just these powerful moments that, the current situation that we're in politically, health-wise with the pandemic, that allow us where there's a lot of uncertainty, where young people are looking, how do I live out of faith? How do I live with peace? How do I live with confidence in God in the midst of what's happening? So live out loud. Help young people around you know why we're not afraid. We do not have to be afraid. The Bible says over and over, do not fear. But how do we overcome that fear and live with hope and faith? They need to see that lived out. So these are just some things that we can do as we're engaging, students around us in this really unique context. Okay, I just want to share any questions actually before I move on. Are there any questions on any of this that I've shared so far? Let's see. Oh, I love that's great. Hmm. Yes. Great word, Chris. Don't feel sorry or fear for our kids, for the world God has called them. Amen. I absolutely agree with that. He is going to equip them. I mean, I have 8-year-old twins, like I said. I mean, my husband and I have seen them, God, for years already cultivating in their lives a sense of confidence. I mean, I have one daughter who dreams regularly, and God has spoken to her and shown things to her so clearly in dreams that my husband and I would not have even thought to necessarily teach her. So this is where God is equipping and empowering these young people to live in this digital Babylon that we are living in today. Okay, great question. How much does this guidance apply to Gen Z or Gen Y or millennials? Is it totally different? There's a lot of things that are when we think broad worldview, like some of the things I've talked about here today, there are a lot of similarities as far as just having grown up with more pluralistic, relativistic society. Now, younger millennials tend to have more similarities to Gen Z than older millennials. Older millennials are kind of like a cusp generation where sometimes you see them more like older generations, sometimes more like younger generations. But there are a lot of similarities when it comes to values and worldviews. There are some stark differences, though, that we're seeing. So Gen Z watched millennials, and as every generation does, they react, right, to what happens to the generation before them. So I'll just share a quick example. Like millennials were very idealistic, very optimistic as young, college students, young adults. One of the things that I love about millennials and why I believe God's positioning them right now to lead us into the next phase. But millennials were very idealistic. So often, they took out a lot of student loans, had a lot of experiences, traveled the world, studied abroad, did all these things, and post a lot of things on social media. And Gen Z saw the implications of having a lot of student debt, not being able to necessarily get a job in the midst of a recession, seeing employers or friends, react to things on social media. So this is where with Gen Z, we're seeing more caution, more sense of I'm going to do what's safe. I'm not going to take out a lot of debt. Student loan debt is dropping right now per student. I'm not going to post a lot of things on social media, or I'm going to post what I think people want to see, not who I truly am. So more of this cautious, realistic, pragmatic tone with Gen Z versus millennials were very optimistic, very purpose-driven. Gen Z tends to be much more practically driven. So those would be some of the changes that, there are some of these changes between these generations, but there are a number of similarities as well. Yeah, great question. Okay, any other questions? Go ahead and drop those in the chat box if you have any more. I think I got them all. Okay, so let me just hit a couple of final points here, just as we think about global missions. And how we engage Gen Z in global missions really quickly. So what we're seeing in America is for every one new convert to Christianity, 4 leaving the faith. For every 1,000 church plants, we're seeing 4,000 churches close their door. 40% of American adults under 30 are nuns, saying they have no faith, no religion. And yet what we're seeing is Christianity is growing globally. Okay, so this is very, very exciting. Even though sometimes in America, some of the numbers are discouraging, Christianity is growing at a rate of 1.27 and the global population is growing at a 1.2. So Christianity is growing faster than the global population. And we're seeing the number of Christians globally in the global South exploding. So globally, evangelicalism is predominantly non-white movement within Christianity. It's becoming increasingly so, with 77% of all evangelicals living in the global South in 2020. So we're seeing an explosion of growth in Asia and Africa, parts of Latin America. And what's exciting is these countries are now mobilizing for what, some have called the global age of missions, where it's not the West going to the rest, but it's the world going to the world. And so as we think about what this means for Gen Z, their role as they engage in global missions is probably going to look a lot different than maybe past generations, as there's going to be more of a partnership in many cases versus individuals going from the West as missionaries to other parts of the world. In some cases, there's even missionaries coming to America now, right? So I think one of the exciting things to think about is, how do we equip this younger generation for this really unique context that they're going to serve in, is likely very, very different from the one that previous generations have lived in and experience. So I think it's some exciting opportunities for Gen Z. I think they're well positioned, these resilient disciples, to engage in this new era of global missions and what that's going to look like. Okay, I'm going to just post really quick again the link in the chat box if you would like all my notes from tonight. And even if you're not able to come tomorrow to my workshop, I'll include all of my notes from my intergenerational teams workshop, which tackles more like specific differences between Gen Z, millennials, Xers, boomers, and how those play out on a work team or a ministry team. So that will get into more of these specifics that were in some of these questions. So, but if you can't come to that, I'll send anyone who signs up on the forum tonight the notes from that session as well. Okay, let me just see if there's any other questions here. Not to be a Debbie Downer. Okay, hold on, I just lost my chat box here. Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, sorry, I lost my place in the chat box here. Yes. Okay. Good point. Yes. That in some parts of, great point about in Uganda, there's a growth of the false prosperity gospel in the churches. So we are seeing this where some of the influences that have come from parts of the West have not been great as they've influenced, churches globally. So some of that is coming from the West. Some of it might be there local as well. I'm not sure. So yes, we do need to continue to pray for the world, right? Do I know how global growth of Christian churches compares to global growth of Islam? Oh, you know what? I just was looking at these statistics. I can't remember exactly the statistics. I was just looking at them. So Lifeway Research, if you look up their facts and trends, I think that's where I read it. Lifeway Research Facts and Trends, I think is where I read that they had the statistics. I can't remember exactly what those were. Or yeah, someone's just saying Ask Frontiers as well. They would know in the exhibit area. Okay, great. If anybody has a question, you can unmute yourself if you want to chime in here. We're actually right on time. I'm supposed to end right at 60 minutes, but my email again was in the chat box, Jolene at leadingtomorrow.org. My website is leadingtomorrow.org. Again, if you fill out that form, I'd be happy to send you the notes. So thank you everyone for joining tonight. I hope you really enjoyed the plenary tonight and the rest of the sessions. I will stick on the call for just a few more minutes if any